Something extraordinary happened this week that most Americans completely missed. And I have to tell you, as someone who has watched Washington operate for decades, I did not see this coming. Canada, our neighbor to the north, the country we have always assumed would eventually bend to American economic pressure, just delivered the most emphatic rejection of United States trade demands that I have witnessed in my lifetime. The balance of power in North American trade may have fundamentally shifted, and tonight, I am going to walk you through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it tells us about where continental relations are heading. Trust me when I say this story is far bigger than it appears on the surface. I have been analyzing political dynamics for a long time now, and I have seen countless negotiations between Washington and Ottawa play out over the years. The pattern has always been relatively predictable. The United States applies pressure. Canada resists initially, and eventually some form of compromise emerges that typically favors American interests. That has been the unwritten rule of continental economics for as long as I can remember. But this week, Prime Minister Mark Carney did something that genuinely surprised the American capital. He did not just push back against Washington's demands, he built what can only be described as an impenetrable wall around Canadian agricultural policy and dared the United States to do something about it. When reporters asked him about American demands for expanded dairy market access, Carney's response was absolute and unequivocal. Supply management is not on the table. He said, "We have been clear about our approach. We will continue to protect supply management." Now, I want you to understand the significance of what I just described, because this is not merely a trade dispute about milk and cheese. This is about sovereignty, national identity, and the fundamental question of whether smaller nations can resist the economic demands of larger neighbors when core domestic policies are at stake. The United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer had made it abundantly clear that expanded American access to Canada's protected dairy market was, in his words, a crucial step for trade talks to succeed. He was not presenting this as one negotiating point among many. He was framing it as a precondition for broader cooperation. Washington essentially told Ottawa that dismantling decades-old agricultural protections was the price of admission for continued trade relations, and Ottawa looked Washington directly in the eye and said, "No." What makes this confrontation so fascinating from my perspective is the strategic sophistication of Canada's response. Carney did not engage with Washington's framing at all. He did not try to justify Canadian policy to American critics or explain why supply management serves Canadian interests. He simply restated the policy as established fact and moved on to other topics. This is textbook sovereignty protection, and I have to admit it was executed brilliantly. When an external power demands that you defend domestic policies developed over 50 years to serve your own citizens, you do not enter that debate on their terms. You reaffirm your position and redirect the conversation toward what you are actually willing to discuss. Carney did exactly that, and in doing so, he demonstrated a level of strategic clarity that Washington clearly did not anticipate. I think what surprised American observers most was the unified front that Canada presented during this confrontation. Carney appeared alongside Ontario Premier Doug Ford, presenting federal and provincial leadership standing together in a display of national solidarity that transcends normal partisan divisions. In Canadian politics, federal and provincial governments often find themselves at odds over jurisdictional questions and policy disagreements. But when external pressure threatens core national interests, those divisions apparently disappear. Ford, who represents a different political tradition than Carney, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister in rejecting American demands. That unity sends a powerful message about Canadian resolve that I do not think Washington fully appreciated before this week. The dairy sector we are discussing here is not some minor economic footnote in Canadian life. It contributes nearly $21 billion annually to Canada's gross domestic product and supports approximately 195,000 jobs across the country. These are not abstract statistics. They represent family farms, rural communities, and an entire way of life that has existed for generations in places like Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia. When Washington demands that Canada open this sector to American competition, they are essentially asking Canadians to sacrifice the economic foundation of rural society to solve an American surplus problem. The United States dairy industry is heavily subsidized and plagued by chronic overpea production, particularly in states like Wisconsin and New York. They need somewhere to dump their excess product, and they view Canada's stable, managed market as the perfect release valve. Carney's response made clear that Canada will not serve that function. I want to take you back through the timeline of events that led to this confrontation because understanding the sequence reveals something important about how dramatically power dynamics have shifted in continental negotiations. This did not happen overnight. It was a calculated escalation by Washington that ultimately backfired in ways that American strategists clearly did not anticipate. And as someone who has watched these dynamics play out for years, I find the miscalculation absolutely remarkable. It began on a Wednesday afternoon when Trade Representative Greer addressed members of Congress to unveil Washington's opening position for the upcoming review of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, commonly known as USMCA or CUSMA, depending on which side of the border you stand. Greer identified three specific Canadian policies as obstacles to American prosperity. He targeted dairy market access restrictions, Canadian laws regulating online platforms designed to support Canadian content creators, and provincial policies regarding alcohol sales. But pay close attention to how he prioritized these demands because the hierarchy tells you everything about Washington's actual objectives. Greer did not present dairy as one concern among several. He weaponized it. He emphasized that expanding access for American dairy was crucial for the trade talks to succeed. That word crucial is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It signals that Washington intended to make Canadian agricultural policy the central battleground of upcoming negotiations. This approach directly echoes the pressure tactics used during the 2018 NAFTA renegotiations when the American dairy lobby secured a 5% tariff-free slice of the Canadian domestic market. At the time, Canadian negotiators presented that concession as the absolute ceiling of what they would accept. Washington apparently interpreted it as merely the floor, a starting point for extracting further concessions in future negotiations. Now emboldened and aggressive, American dairy interests want significantly more access than they obtained in the previous round. And I have to tell you, the assumptions underlying this strategy reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of Canadian political realities that I find genuinely surprising from experienced trade negotiators. The response from Ottawa came Thursday morning, and it arrived with a symbolic flourish that sent a clear message about intended audiences. When a reporter asked Carney about American demands in English, the Prime Minister responded in French. That linguistic choice was not accidental. It was strategic communication aimed directly at Quebec, where supply management is not merely agricultural policy, but represents the economic backbone of rural society and a pillar of cultural identity. Quebec is home to nearly half of all dairy farms in Canada. By switching to French, Carney signaled that his primary audience was not the lobbyists in Washington, but the hardworking families in St. Ainthe and the Beauce region who depend on stable dairy prices for their livelihoods. He was telling Quebec that the federal government would protect their interests against American pressure regardless of the political cost. What struck me most about Carney's response was what he did not say. He did not engage with Washington's framing of the issue. He did not acknowledge American concerns as legitimate grievances requiring Canadian accommodation. He did not offer partial concessions or suggest willingness to negotiate around the edges of supply management. He simply stated Canadian policy as established fact and moved on. Period. Full stop. No qualifications, no hedging, no diplomatic wiggle room. This is a fundamentally different approach than we have seen from previous Canadian governments, and I think it reflects a genuine shift in how Ottawa understands its position in continental relations. The confrontation also reveals something fascinating about the fragility of American negotiating leverage when pushed to its logical extreme. Carney disclosed during Thursday's press conference that Canada and the United States were actually close to reaching a broader agreement in late October. Talks were progressing toward a framework that both sides could accept. Then something bizarre happened. The Ontario government ran an advertisement featuring former President Ronald Reagan speaking against tariffs. Donald Trump saw this advertisement and was apparently triggered by the use of Reagan's words. He abruptly called off the negotiations. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States suspended critical economic negotiations with its largest trading partner because a Canadian province engaged in political discourse featuring an American president. Carney's response to this disruption was measured but revealing. Canada will negotiate in good faith, he said, but we will not modify our domestic democracy to accommodate American presidential sensitivities. We are partners, not subordinates. I need to explain why the American strategy here represents such a significant miscalculation, because understanding the flawed assumptions underlying Washington's approach reveals important truths about how continental power dynamics have evolved. For decades, American trade negotiators have operated on a singular assumption. When the United States demands economic concessions from Canada, Ottawa eventually complies because the alternative, restricted access to the American market, is simply too costly to accept. That assumption shaped strategy during the original NAFTA negotiations. It shaped strategy during the USMCA renegotiations, and it clearly shaped the approach that Trade Representative Greer unveiled this week. The problem is that assumption may no longer be accurate, and Washington appears not to have noticed. The fundamental miscalculation rests on outdated arithmetic about Canadian economic vulnerability. Yes, the United States purchases approximately 75% of Canadian exports. That statistic has traditionally been interpreted as evidence of overwhelming American leverage. If Washington restricts market access, the reasoning goes Canada suffers disproportionately and must therefore accept American demands to preserve trade flows. But this analysis ignores what Canada brings to the relationship. Canada controls critical minerals essential for American national defense and the electric vehicle revolution. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other strategic resources flow south across the border in quantities that American industry cannot easily replace from other sources. Canada provides energy security that powers northeastern American states through electricity exports and pipeline connections. Canadian transportation corridors and regulatory frameworks support American businesses in ways that would be extremely costly to replicate. When Greer positions dairy access as crucial to trade talks succeeding, Ottawa hears a threat that contains its own contradiction. If Washington makes agreement contingent on Canada dismantling 50-year-old agricultural frameworks, they are defining success in ways that make agreement impossible. They are essentially telling Canada that the price of continued cooperation is the surrender of sovereignty over domestic policy. And Carney's government has clearly decided that price is too high to pay, regardless of the consequences. This is not bluster or negotiating posture. This reflects a genuine strategic choice about where Canadian interests lie and what principles Ottawa is willing to defend even at significant economic cost. I think what many Americans fail to appreciate is the symbolic importance of supply management in Canadian political culture. This is not merely an agricultural policy that can be traded away for concessions in other sectors. It represents something deeper about Canadian identity and the relationship between government and citizens. Supply management emerged in the 1970s as a framework for ensuring stable prices and protecting family farms against the boom and bust volatility that characterizes American agricultural markets. For 50 years, it has provided Canadian dairy farmers with predictable income while shielding consumers from wild price fluctuations. To dismantle this system would not merely change agricultural economics, it would represent a symbolic surrender of the right to be different, to organize society according to Canadian rather than American preferences. Carney understands this symbolic dimension perfectly, and his response to American demands reflects that understanding. When he says supply management is not on the table, he is not merely defending a specific policy. He is asserting Canada's right to govern itself without external permission. He is telling Washington that some things are simply not negotiable regardless of what leverage the United States believes it possesses. and he is betting that this principled stance will ultimately command respect rather than retaliation because the alternative, endless capitulation to American demands, would leave Canada with nothing left to negotiate once the precedent of surrender is established. The connection between this dairy confrontation and broader continental tensions deserves careful attention because the pattern is unmistakable. Remember what Greer mentioned alongside dairy in his congressional testimony. He targeted Canadian laws affecting online platforms, specifically the Online Streaming Act, designed to ensure that foreign streaming services like Netflix contribute to Canadian cultural production. Washington views this legislation as an unfair restriction on American business. Canada views it as essential for cultural survival in the digital age. The underlying conflict is identical to the dairy dispute. The United States demands that Canada restructure domestic policy to accommodate American commercial interests, and Canada refuses on grounds of sovereignty. Whether the subject is agricultural protections or digital regulations, Ottawa's message is consistent. Canadian markets serve Canadian citizens first, and foreign approval is not required for domestic lawmaking. I want to step back now and consider what this confrontation tells us about the future of continental relations, because I believe we are witnessing something genuinely significant that will shape North American economics and politics for years to come. The Canada that existed during previous rounds of trade negotiations, the country that eventually yielded to American pressure because it saw no alternative, that Canada may no longer exist. In its place stands a nation that has developed alternatives, built leverage, and demonstrated willingness to defend core principles even when the world's most powerful economy demands otherwise. This transformation did not happen overnight. It reflects years of strategic planning and diversification that positioned Ottawa to say no when the moment arrived. The diversification of Canadian trade relationships fundamentally changes the calculus underlying continental negotiations. Through the comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the European Union, Canada gained access to a market of over 400 million consumers with sophisticated tastes and substantial purchasing power. Through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada anchored itself in the booming economies of the Pacific Rim, from Japan and Australia to Vietnam and Malaysia. These agreements do not eliminate Canadian interest in American market access, but they eliminate the desperation that once characterized Ottawa's approach to Washington. Canada is no longer a country with only one trading partner that matters. It is a country with options, and options create leverage that simply did not exist during previous negotiating rounds. When Carney stated Thursday that Ottawa will only sign an agreement that works for Canadians, he was not engaging in empty rhetoric. He was describing a genuine negotiating posture backed by economic alternatives. If the United States makes demands that Canada finds unacceptable, Ottawa can walk away from the table knowing that other markets exist, other partnerships have been cultivated, and national prosperity does not depend entirely on pleasing Washington. This changed reality means that American pressure tactics that once produced Canadian concessions may now produce Canadian resistance instead. The threat of restricted market access carries less weight when the target has developed alternatives and demonstrated willingness to absorb costs rather than surrender on principle. I find myself genuinely impressed by the strategic sophistication of Canada's position, and I say this as someone who has spent decades analyzing political and legal dynamics in Washington. Carney's government appears to understand something that American negotiators have missed. The question is not merely what concessions each side will make in upcoming trade talks. The question is what precedent gets established about the nature of the continental relationship. If Canada yields on supply management because Washington demands it, that capitulation establishes a template for future negotiations. It signals that Canadian domestic policy is ultimately subject to American approval, that Ottawa will restructure fundamental frameworks when the United States applies sufficient pressure. Once that precedent exists, what stops Washington from demanding changes to environmental regulations, resource management policies, or even healthcare systems in future rounds of talks? Carney has clearly decided that the long-term costs of capitulation exceed the short-term costs of resistance by drawing an absolute line around supply management. He is establishing a boundary that defines where Canadian negotiating flexibility ends. He is telling Washington that some elements of Canadian sovereignty are simply not for sale, regardless of what leverage the United States believes it possesses. And he is betting that consistent principled resistance will ultimately produce better outcomes than tactical retreats that invite further demands. This is a sophisticated understanding of negotiating dynamics that recognizes how concessions in one area can undermine positions in other areas by signaling willingness to yield under pressure. The economic stakes of this confrontation extend far beyond the dairy sector itself, though those stakes are substantial enough to matter on their own terms. Nearly $21 billion in annual economic activity and almost $200,000 jobs depend on the stable framework that supply management provides. These are family farms that have existed for generations, rural communities whose entire economic base rests on dairy production and processing facilities that add value to agricultural output. When Washington demands that Canada open this sector to subsidized American competition, they are asking Canadians to sacrifice these communities for the convenience of Wisconsin dairy producers who need somewhere to dump their surplus production. Carney's refusal to accept this bargain reflects genuine concern for Canadian citizens whose livelihoods depend on policies that Washington finds inconvenient. But the stakes extend beyond economics to questions of national identity and the meaning of sovereignty in an interconnected world. For 50 years, supply management has represented a distinctively Canadian approach to agricultural policy, one that prioritizes stability over volatility, family farms over corporate consolidation, and domestic food security over international market integration. This framework reflects Canadian values about the relationship between government, economy, and community that differ meaningfully from American approaches. To dismantle supply management at American insistence would not merely change agricultural policy. Carney understands this symbolic dimension and has positioned his government as defender of Canadian distinctiveness against homogenizing pressure from south of the border. The formal review of the trade agreement begins next year, and the ground rules have shifted fundamentally based on this week's events. Canada has stated publicly and repeatedly that food sovereignty is non-negotiable. Washington can choose to accept that boundary and negotiate within it, seeking gains in other areas where flexibility might exist. Or Washington can choose to make dairy access a deal breaker, insisting that Canada must yield on this point before productive negotiations can proceed. If American negotiators choose the latter course, they are not really negotiating anymore. They are issuing ultimatums, and ultimatums represent leverage that Washington is discovering it no longer possesses in the way it once did. I have been thinking about what this moment means for broader patterns in international relations, and I believe the implications extend well beyond the Canada-United States relationship. We are witnessing a middle power demonstrate that principled resistance to superpower demands is possible when sufficient preparation has occurred and genuine alternatives exist. Canada is not a global superpower. It cannot match American military or economic strength in absolute terms, but it has cultivated relationships, developed resources, and positioned itself strategically in ways that create leverage beyond what its raw size would suggest. Other nations facing pressure from larger neighbors will watch how this confrontation unfolds and draw conclusions about the possibilities for their own situations. The American assumption that size automatically translates to negotiating dominance rests on premises that may no longer hold in a multipolar world where alternatives have proliferated and smaller nations have developed sophisticated strategies for protecting their interests. Canada's approach to these trade negotiations demonstrates that preparation, diversification, and principled consistency can create effective counterweights to raw economic power. When Carney tells Washington that Canada is a partner rather than a subordinate, he is articulating a vision of international relations that challenges American expectations about how smaller nations should behave when dealing with their larger neighbor. I want to close by emphasizing what I believe is the central lesson of this week's events. The Canada that folded under pressure during previous negotiations appears to have transformed into something different, something harder and more strategically sophisticated than American policymakers anticipated. This transformation did not happen through rhetoric or posturing. It happened through years of patient work-building trade relationships, developing domestic industrial capacity, and cultivating the political unity necessary to resist external pressure when it arrives. Carney's government inherited these preparations and has demonstrated willingness to use them in service of Canadian interests. The dairy farmers in Quebec and Ontario will sleep better tonight, knowing their government defended their interests against American demands. The rural communities across the prairies will operate with confidence that Ottawa understands what supply management means for their way of life. And a Canadian government that just told the world superpower that sovereignty is not up for debate will move to the next negotiating table with its credibility intact and its principles uncompromised.